Well, time for our panel this Monday afternoon. Our political strategists, Bruce Hawker and Grahame Morris, join us. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon. I want to start on people smugglers and the whole asylum seeker policy challenge. And before we get to whether it's a good idea or whether it did happen or whether it's been well handled, this issue of potentially paying people smugglers and crew to go back to Indonesia. Bruce, I just want to pick up on something Tanya Plibersek was saying to us earlier, the Deputy Labor leader, earlier this hour on the program, on whether Labor will embrace the policy of turnbacks, something they've resisted until now. She kept saying, look, there'll be debate about this in the coming months and at the Labor Party conference. Calling a spade, what do you reckon? Should Labor just get over this and adopt what the government's got, holus bolus?
Yeah, although I think they should stop short of actually paying the smugglers to get people across the line. Look, this was a fraught area for Labor, as we all know, and you know, for all the right reasons, we probably at the end of the day came up with the wrong outcomes. And I think Labor really just has to be very, very careful about re-engaging on this one. It's a bit of a sucker ball, really, for them. You know, the government will try everything they can to draw them in on this issue. And even this question about paying people to stop smuggling could potentially have that effect on Labor in a funny sort of a way, because I think the more we talk about this issue, the less appealing it is for the public, and it does tend to remind them of the problems that we confronted when we were dealing with this issue. And
so you reckon this is a good strategy today to focus on this for Labor? Because there's some debate about whether, you know, it is a big vulnerability for Labor, a big weak spot for them given the record. But there are some legitimate questions about what's gone on here with possible payments. Is it a good idea to focus on this?
Well, it's a vexed issue, really, because, you know, personally, I would say, yes, we should be finding out what the heck went on there. And there's a very fundamental issue there about the Prime Minister not actually answering a very basic question. But then should we move on from it pretty quickly? I think the answer to that is yes too. I think the longer that Labor actually deals with this issue and dwells in this space, the less likely we're going to be talking about, you know, the cost of living, the impact of you know, this government's budget on ordinary people. And I think that's where Labor has to return to all the time.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. Don't hang around too long on this issue. Now, Grahame Morris, let's bring you in on this. What do you think about how this whole issue has been handled so far by the government? Initially, last week, Peter Dutton saying no payments were made, the Foreign Minister as well. Then the Prime Minister saying no comment on whether payments were made. That now, of course, is the position that all have had to adopt. Has that been a problem?
Certainly been a bit untidy, David, but look, when you look at this, what are we trying to do? A, make sure people don't drown, and B, make sure none of these people get to Australia through unauthorised channels. Now, you know, I don't know, and I suspect only ASIO and a couple of naval people would ever know, but it's not all that long, whether or not any money has changed hands, but it's not all that long ago. Many of us, including the Labor Party, were saying, hey, let's buy the boat people's boats. Now, what's the difference between that and turning a boat around and giving somebody a few bucks to pay for petrol?
That was
Scott Morrison's proposal, not a Labor idea. It was ridiculed by Labor.
That's right.
Yeah, but what is wrong with that principle, or giving somebody some petrol money and saying, you're not welcome here, go home, here's some petrol money? You know,
petrol money might be one thing, but is $5,000 a pop, 30 grand US all up, petrol money?
Well, I don't know. And how do you know? How do you know that was what
I would imagine it wouldn't cost $30,000 to drive a boat back to Indonesia from wherever it was intercepted. Well, pretty sure about that.
I don't know what fuel is on a boat, but nobody would know exactly what figure was paid, if any money was paid. We're taking the word of a couple of asylum seekers here, and goodness knows it may well have been petrol money. But either way, I don't care. You know, the idea that, you know, you might sling somebody a few bucks to go home, well, so what?
Well, it's hardly a war.
Bruce, if that's what it is, bit of petrol money, is that justified?
Well, as Crikey pointed out today, paying people off is hardly declaring war on them, which is what Scott Morris and others were talking about previously. Look, I think the most important thing here is that the Prime Minister comes out and says what actually happened. He can't just pretend that the issue isn't there and refuse to answer it. It's a matter of public interest as to whether Australian taxpayers' money was spent paying off people smugglers or not.
At the end of the day, though, if they are people smugglers, they are doing something that neither side of politics here wants, and apparently Indonesia doesn't want either. It's against the law now in Indonesia to engage in people smuggling. If that's what they've done, shouldn't they be locked up? Shouldn't they be detained either by the Australian officials or, as Philip Ruddock made a good point earlier, by the Indonesian authorities as well, who are now looking into all of this? Shouldn't they be actually arresting these people?
Well, answer yes, rather than actually being paid off. I mean, it's like paying a bribe or blackmail money. This is what the government's effectively doing. If they should be imposing criminal sanctions rather than just giving them money under the table. I think that's where the issue really resides. What is the government doing here? They're saying one thing on the one hand. Well, if they think it's appropriate to go and pay them off, well, come out and say it's appropriate to pay them off. Just answer the question. That's all people are asking for, and then let's move on.
Yeah, I mean, Grahame, at the end of the day, would you like to see them locked up, the people who are involved in this?
Yeah, of course I would. Yeah. But my priority, and I think it's everyone's priorities, ought to be that you discourage people from coming at all and drowning. And if you just let them come to Australia and you say, all right, fellas, well, keep coming, welcome, and several get through, then you'll have a whole flood again. So I think while ever we can keep the borders safe, even if it costs us a few bucks, well, good stuff.
Let's talk about the what I was saying earlier will be the substantive issue of this sitting fortnight, the government's legislation on stripping citizenship from dual nationals engaged in terrorism. We've heard a number of people raise concerns about whether this is going to be constitutional, whether you should have a court actually convict someone before they lose their citizenship. Grahame, you first on this one. What do you think about some of the concerns that have been expressed? Is it a legitimate concern?
Look, I do understand them, and I respect our court system, obviously. It's what the nation's built on. And at some stage, one of these will go to court and it'll be challenged. But, if you can just think of it from the legislator's point of view, that we let a couple of these people back. We sort of let them muck around in the courts for a while. And something happened. You'd never forgive yourself. And I tell you what, I've seen what's happened to family law courts and judges, and what happens, to threats with them. Just imagine the threats that would happen in a court case like this. Now, that's not a reason not to have a court case, but it's an extra thing that I haven't seen written about, and that is the danger to those on the bench who would be hearing this sort of a case. Look, I do understand the concerns, but if I were a lawmaker, I'd be trying everything I can, including stripping citizenship off them.
The flip side, I suppose, of that is if you make it a politician who's making this decision, they too will face a lot of pressure, arguably even more, because they're a public figure. They're going to be inundated, presumably, with people saying, oh, the bloke down the road is a terrorist, you should get rid of his citizenship. I mean, and political pressure will be brought to bear in certain circumstances as well.
Well, that's right, but, there's a cast of thousands of federal police, ASIO, ASIS and all of those sort of people who will have real information. And I suspect a lot of that information could not be presented in an open court. So...
Yeah,
look,
that's a good point.
This is not going to be misused, but by geez, it ought to be there as a threat.
Yeah, and this is the difference with some jurisdictions like the United States, where I think, Bruce, they have courts that can be closed to hear some of this stuff. We don't have that sort of separate closed court system. So
well, we do, actually.
You don't want to expose informants. Well, you can have a closed hearing, but you don't want to run any risk of exposing an informant, someone who is providing human intelligence on a terrorism matter. Is there some argument, do you think, for giving the minister the discretion to do this?
No, I don't think there is, and we can have provision for closing courts in Australia, so I don't see that as being a huge issue. I mean, the family court proceedings are all held in closed hearings, so the courts can easily manage that. But, you know, this week is the 800th anniversary of the signing of Magna Carta, and I was flicking through my copy of Magna Carta just today, and what should come up, Chapter 29, which is still part of our law, which says that no man shall be disseized of his property and put to death or exiled without first being put before a tribunal of his peers. Now, that's something which is part of our law, has been part of our law since 1215. And it plays a very fundamental part of the system that we've come to cherish in the British tradition and in the American tradition. The Fifth Amendment does exactly the same thing. It protects people against arbitrary decisions of governments and ensures that the courts play a central role.
Mate.
Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, it is fundamental to the way in which our system of justice operates. And we've managed for 800 years to deal with the courts sitting side by side with our politicians, and the separation of powers should continue forever. This is an incursion into that. It doesn't mean that the courts can't have a role. They should have a role, and the politicians should have a role as well. But the court should be there all the time, making the final decisions about these matters, and they are very well equipped to do so.
Despite Magna Carta, it's not all that long ago that anyone doing this would have been charged with treason and shot.
Well, they would have been charged and they would have gone before a court and then shot. And that's the problem here, Grahame. We're listening to a government saying that politicians should be making these calls. It should be up to courts to make these calls, one step removed. That's why we have a separation of powers. That's fundamental to our system.
Let's turn to Bill Shorten. While Tony Abbott may not be wanting to comment on whether payments were made to people smugglers, Bill Shorten doesn't want to comment on the ins and outs of his time at the AWU and the workplace agreements that were struck. He says he will when he fronts the Royal Commission. Now, that's still another 2 months away, so we're not going to get answers. But, Bruce, how damaging do you think this is going to be for Bill Shorten, and how serious is it already, given some of the allegations that are out there about deals done with companies and the AWU that arguably may have dudded workers?
Well, unlike Tony Abbott, he says he will answer those questions and he'll do so before a Royal Commission. So we will be getting the answers to any questions that the Royal Commission wants to put to him. We're just going to have to wait 2 months for it, you know, and in the Twitter world that we live in now.
But is that sustainable? I mean, why can't he answer questions now about it?
Well, because it's appropriate that this thing go before the Royal Commission and any questions that are asked of him be answered by him under oath in that forum. These issues have arisen essentially out of this Royal Commission. It's appropriate for him to go before it and answer those questions, and he will. So along the way, of course, there'll be a lot of speculation about it and so forth, and it's the sort of thing I'm sure he wouldn't want to have hanging around. But there is an end game here, unlike the Tony Abbott scenario that we've just been discussing, where he's just refusing to answer questions.
At the end of the day, Bruce, if take one of the examples in particular that a company, a construction firm paid the AWU for the membership fees of about 105 of its workers, the argument being this was to keep the more militant CFMEU off the work site. But you know, what does the company do that for? What is the reason? Well, so that they're not going to be facing a higher wages bill if a different union were to pick up some of those workers. I mean, is that a problem as you see it, that a union leader would cut such a deal?
Well, the world of industrial politics is fraught, David, and there are a lot of these instances of demarcations happening all the time. It's central to the union system of coverage of workplaces. It's not necessarily a particularly attractive one, but it just happens. I think a more fundamental problem is when the AWU uses its numbers signing people up in order to increase its position at the national conference, it's increase its membership for the purposes of voting. I think that's a much more fundamental problem that Labor has to deal with, and we've talked about that in the past.
Well, and you've got strong views on all of that, but it goes to pre-selections, of which Bill Shorten's was one in Victoria. Grahame, what do you think about all of this? We've seen this Royal Commission already put questions to Julia Gillard about that whole slush fund saga 20 years ago. She emerged from that, I think, relatively unscathed. But what do you think about Bill Shorten here? Is he in some real trouble?
Well, it looks as if he was presiding over a very nasty little dung heap. But look, if I were advising him, I would say, look, Bill, why don't you do a big set-piece thing that answers most a thing? You don't take questions, but a set-piece speech. And then you just say to the journos, look, you heard my speech, and now I'm going to the Royal Commission. But before we get too excited about this, in most Royal Commissions I've found that the minute somebody with a high public profile is on there, counsel assisting are as weak as water. And it's not often that some high-profile person really gets grilled. They just say, excuse me, what's your name, what do you want to say? Weak as water.
Well, it's not like that down at the ICAC, I can tell you. In New South Wales, it's a much different story. You come out wondering what your second name is.
It's an interesting point, because we've seen Kevin Rudd front the Pink Bats Royal Commission, Julia Gillard front this one. John Howard once fronted a very different inquiry in years gone by as well. It's an interesting point, Grahame. You think the council assisting don't go hard enough?
Well, let's see if they've got a backbone, or they just say yes sir, no sir.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. We'll catch up again next week.
See you, mate.
We will take a quick break on PM Agenda. Do stay with us. Back with more.